Hi everybody, welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our class for the 6th of August. And today we are talking about speech number 2. Congratulations for finishing speech number 1. No rest for the weary, though. I wanted you to start thinking about your second speech and sort of give you a sense as to what it is that we will be doing as we transition over into informative speeches. So I have 3 chapters that are scheduled today about visual media, because you will be using visual media for your informative speech, as well as just general information on informative speeches, and also some supporting materials. And I didn't necessarily think that you would be using supporting materials for the second speech. That's pretty much up to you to make a decision as to whether or not you think you'd like to use supporting materials. But basically, what I'm asking you to do at this particular point is to utilize whatever knowledge or understanding you have about the topic that you choose for your informative speech. But if you do elect to use outside resources, then I thought it would be useful for you to have that chapter. And you will be using outside resources for the last chapter, or I should say for the last speech, the persuasive speech. So whether you utilize outside sources now or you utilize them in the future, I thought that would be very useful for you. And in terms of where we are with speech number 2, if you could please contact me via email to indicate whether or not you wanted to do speech number 2 via Zoom, and some of you elected to do speech number 1 via Zoom. And what I'll do is what I did previously, I'll gather all of the individuals who think they want to perform via Zoom, and I'll try to find a common time for all of us. And you've also got the option, if you prefer, uploading your speech via Moodle. And that would be done on the 13th of August, and that's a Thursday. So for those of you who gave speech number 1 via Zoom, I very much enjoyed listening to those speeches, and we gave each other some informal feedback. For those of you that have uploaded your speeches, I will be watching those speeches, and that's what today's attendance question is going to be, asking you to review the speeches of your classmates and to identify a strength and a place for improvement in each of those speeches. And I'm going to ask you to send me that via email rather than using our student forum, so that I can gather all of the responses together and put them together and present them to the individual who was giving that particular speech. So again, and you'll see this in our notes, your attendance question is to watch all of the speeches that your classmates have posted up on Moodle, and to identify strengths and weaknesses. And as you know, you have the opportunity of earning 5 extra credit points if you were to evaluate your own speech and do more than just identify one strength and one weakness, but write up about a paragraph or so of your impressions of your performance, and I would be happy to give you a little bit of extra credit. So the idea is that hopefully you will have the opportunity to watch yourself, and you will have the opportunity to experience that in the way that you would be experiencing the speeches of your peers. So what we will do next week on the 11th, which happens to be a Tuesday, you will be doing quiz number 2, and I will be doing quiz 2 in a very similar way to what I did with quiz 1. I'll post the quiz, 20 questions, and mostly a short answer, but some true, false, and multiple choice. You'll have 48 hours in which to respond, and then I will review your answers and send you back your grade. You've also got, or what we've got scheduled is a practice session. So what I'm going to do during that particular class is to ask you to set up a practice session either on the 11th or basically any time prior to the 13th, which is when your speech number 2 is due. So feel free to use the class of the 11th, or if you wanted to use another date, again, contact me via email and indicate when you would like to set up a time for your practice session for speech number 2, and I'll try to accommodate you. It'll be very similar to what we did with the practice session for speech number 1. Some of you had elected to actually perform a speech and get my feedback. Some of you just wanted to chat a little bit about your topic or about your outline. It's all good. Some of you wanted to meet via Zoom. Some of you wanted to meet via phone. Again, whatever's most convenient. So I want to try to be flexible and accessible in terms of what I'm calling that practice session. So in relation to thinking about what you could consider in relation to informative speeches, and this is in chapter 12, that basically your job is to teach the audience something. And while it's true that your autobiographical speech did teach us a little bit about your background, the focus was, again, on your personal history. The informative speech, while it can incorporate elements of your personal history, basically the focus is a topic that's outside of your life experience. So you're teaching the audience something, and if you've got the current version of the textbook on page 196, what you will see are some suggested ways that you could identify a topic, either by talking about a famous person or a particular place, a thing, an event, an idea, even a procedure. You've got 10 minutes and you are being asked to use some sort of audio-visual aid. And that's pretty broad, the audio-visual, especially in the current situation that we're in, presenting via Zoom or uploading our speeches. But basically, when we talk about visual media, we'll talk about how ultimately it's very useful to use visual media in terms of helping an audience understand your topic and retain that information. As you know, we talked a little bit about memory and that we have pretty poor memories. We can manage perhaps plus or minus 7 items without using some very specific techniques like repetition, or using something like chunking or a mnemonic technique in order for us to remember those pieces of information, which is something to consider when you are presenting or trying to teach information to an audience. What can you do to help your audience understand and remember the content that you happen to be sharing? There's a lot of different ways you can do this. You can do an explanation where basically you're talking to the audience, or you can demonstrate something. In other words, you're showing the audience how to do something, or some combination of the two. And there are pros and cons to each. It's just a question of personal preference, and again, knowing your audience well and thinking about what might work best for them, and also understanding your topic and understanding what perhaps makes most sense for your particular topic. Some suggestions I have, regardless of what you decide to discuss, is that you want to try to limit your points. You've got only 10 minutes, but you'd be surprised how much you can learn in 10 minutes. And again, you don't want to overwhelm your audience with too much information. Use transitions, try to show connections between ideas. Avoid jargon, overly unnecessarily technical language, or language that's very specialized to a very small group of individuals. Cluster-like ideas, in other words, that you want to put like things together. Associating the old with the new. And that is an old teacher technique when we usually serve as building pieces of information one on top of another. You'll oftentimes see this in a math class, that you need to learn a particular skill, and then once you've got that skill, then a new skill is introduced that requires the previous skill. Repetition, as I had indicated earlier, it's one of the ways that our memory works, just by repeating over and over again. Addressing different learning styles, and that's something too that is probably evidenced in many of the classes that you've taken, in that teachers try to present information in a variety of ways. So while they speak, they probably also use a whiteboard or a smart board at the same time. And one of the reasons why is because they're trying to appeal to visual learners who would like to see the content, as well as auditory learners who would like to hear the content. And then, of course, usually there's some reading that's associated with that particular class, and that's for individuals who tend to absorb content through reading. So the idea is that hopefully, if we're presenting information in a lot of different ways, it'll be easier for you to access that information. And that's one of the reasons why I am asking for an audio-visual for this particular speech, because it's just another way that you can show information that will help your audience understand and remember. And sometimes you need to motivate your audience. It could be that you're sharing information that they aren't particularly interested in. That's less of an issue with the 10-minute speech because it's so short that basically I think that most people have an inherent level of curiosity, especially college students, so that just about any topic can't be necessarily exhausted or become boring, so to speak, in 10 minutes. But think about the 10-week semester class, for instance, where I'm very well aware that sometimes students are in classes that aren't necessarily their first choice, but they're there for a variety of reasons, and oftentimes it's to satisfy a requirement. It's not necessarily reflective of a personal interest. And we as teachers try our best to accommodate those students and to try to show how the topic is interesting and relevant to their lives, even though they may not necessarily see that initially. So whether or not we're successful, that's another question. But if there's anything you can do to motivate your audience, and I think I shared with you in a previous class a speech that I'll never forget about the Heimlich maneuver. And the reason why I won't forget about that speech is because the speaker had basically set up a situation where it appeared that someone was choking in class and that he saved that person through using the Heimlich maneuver. And then after the fact, we found out that the whole situation had been staged. No one was choking. No Heimlich maneuver had truly been performed. But the question to us as audience is that if we had experienced something real, would we know what to do? And in other words, what the speaker was trying to do was to motivate us to be interested in a topic that might be considered to be a little bit dry. And he did a very good job at doing that. I think I mentioned the story in the context of sort of surprising your audience or doing something that's unexpected. And again, that comes with a certain level of risk. You have to be careful about what it is that you're doing and understand that there could be consequences that are unforeseen. But in terms of that particular speech, it worked very, very well. So your visual media, regardless of what visual media you decide to use, whether it's low tech, something like a poster or a picture or a prop, or it's something that's a little bit more high tech, like a video or an audio clip or some sort of Zoom screen sharing or PowerPoint, what you do want to do is be professional. You want to make sure that you're testing your equipment beforehand. You want to have a backup plan in the event that there's some sort of mechanical failure. Charts tend to work very well for numbers, and pictures tend to work very well for emotions. And human beings are motivated by both, by information and also by emotion. You want to be clear, you want to be simple, you want to be neat. You also want to think about the proportion and balance. Remember that an audiovisual is supposed to supplement your speech, not replace it. So the bulk of your speech should be you, not your audiovisual necessarily. You want to consider scale. Is it an audiovisual that can be seen by your audience members? Use color definitely for interest, but you don't want to overuse color or overwhelm the audience. And definitely if you're using text, avoid all capitals. You can capitalize a word or several words, but if you've ever seen everything capitalized, you know that it's a difficult thing to read. By and far, at least when I taught this class in person, PowerPoint was probably the most preferred mode of using for an audio visual, and I have no problem with PowerPoint. I think it can work quite well when it's used well, and I suspect all of us have had experiences where we've seen PowerPoint not being used well. I don't know if you've ever heard of a flip chart, which is a large chart of paper with basically the individual reveals each sheet for new pieces of information. I'd like to think of that flip chart as sort of the old school version of what PowerPoint has become. The advantage of PowerPoint is that you get to decide when you are going to reveal pieces of information. But I'm sure you can come up with many stories, as I myself can, about ways that PowerPoint has been misused and abused, whether it's reading off of the slides themselves and not necessarily presenting to the audience, which was something that the Toastmaster video talked about, or presenting too much information on the slides, so again the audience can't absorb it. having slides that aren't timed perhaps to your presentation, having some sort of technical or mechanical difficulty someplace in the middle of the presentation and not having a backup. In fact, I've oftentimes had students use their PowerPoint slides as their outline, and that's perfectly fine. But I've always suggested that they have a printed copy of that and not rely on the electronic version. In the event that there were technical issues, the last thing you want to lose is your outline as well as your presentation. And what I call, just because you can, that doesn't mean you should. PowerPoint gives you lots of options, and there isn't any reason for you to use every single one of those options and just overwhelm the audience with color and overwhelm the audience with dozens, if not hundreds, of fonts and styles. Again, be simple, be neat, be clear. Think about things like visibility and how easy it would be for an audience to digest or dissect. But that said, there are lots of other options. There are handouts, which is going to be a little bit trickier because we aren't meeting in person, but that allows the audience to walk away with something. So if you've got sensitive information or information you don't want your audience to forget, that could be a very useful audio-visual. You can do something low-tech, like use a blackboard or a whiteboard. Usually that works very well in the moment if you wanted to do a quick illustration or example, or if you're having technical failures, that could be your backup if necessary. You can have props. Again, you want to think about the visibility of that prop and how well the audience would be able to see that particular prop. You can have posters and pamphlets and any kind of textual media. Again, you want to make sure that it's neat and that it's professional, and it's not just the English teacher in me that says not to make spelling errors, especially if you're projecting something, because it's bad enough to make a spelling error, but it's much, much worse when you're projecting it to this huge scale and then you can see that particular spelling error. Now, in terms of our particular class, because of the way that we're conducting it this summer, I suspect that some of you might want to do some screen sharing if you are presenting via Zoom, and Zoom allows you that option so that you can share your screen with your audience, almost like showing a PowerPoint presentation. However, you don't necessarily have to rely on that. It could be as low-tech as just showing a picture of somebody who is important to you or something that's important to you. Or again, if you happen to be recording your speeches, you've got lots of different ways that you could go about using some sort of audio visual. While I've been focusing on visuals, audio can be just as powerful as well. So think about what you might want to do with an audio visual, and that's one of the things that I'll talk about with you during our particular practice session. And then the last chapter I had assigned, chapter 6, was about supporting material. And that basically supporting material increases your credibility and increases your persuasiveness. So you want to check this material for accuracy. And that, of course, is the double-edged sword of the internet. The internet gives us an incredible amount of information, but that's not necessarily correct information. So you want to be cautious when you're on the open web. And while Google and Wikipedia are usually people's first go-to, myself included, in trying to get information, I'm not averse to either one of those. You do want to make sure that you're using sources that have been verified for accuracy. And if you don't have the time or the energy to verify for yourself, the good news is somebody's done it for you in the GCC library. If you use their resources, or really any academic library's resources. This is my attempt to convince you to use the GCC library database system, which looks like you're using the internet, where you can access information like articles and so forth. However, these have all been reviewed by individuals to verify their accuracy. That said, I always take everything I read with a grain of salt. I want to be the one that's verifying for accuracy. I believe I shared a story with you previously, but if I didn't, it was about the New York Times, and back in the 1990s, actually, and the reporter Jason Blair who basically was fired for fabricating stories. And the way this particular piece went is that he had been given an assignment to interview a soldier's family during the Iraqi war in the early 90s. And he did that piece, but the family called the offices of the newspaper asking how did that happen, because they never spoke with the reporter. And there were some simple but obvious factual errors in the article, things like the color of their home. And after the New York Times did some investigating, and the New York Times, especially at that time period, considered the newspaper of record, very prestigious, they did some fact checking, and they found out that their reporter had never gone to the Midwest to conduct his interview the way he was assigned to do. And there was evidence of that because he had basically charged lunch in Manhattan, which is where the New York Times is housed, to his business account, and that was proof that he was in Manhattan rather than in the Midwest. And as they continued to do research, they found out that he'd been doing that for quite a while. So I know it was quite a stunning surprise to many people in the early 1990s that the newspaper of record, the New York Times, could have that kind of deception going on, albeit unknowingly, which I always use as an example of why you want to verify your particular sources. So I hope that you do consider using the databases. There's a wealth of information there. I don't know if you've ever had an opportunity to review some of those databases, but not only do they give you access to academic articles, but they also will give you access to specific topics. And they will also give you access to things like particular newspapers, including the New York Times and the Greenfield Recorder. So if you happen to be a news junkie, that's something that you could utilize as well. And the GCC library also has access to a lot of streaming videos, oftentimes associated with academia, that you wouldn't be able to find on the wide internet or on a Netflix or an Amazon streaming account that you could access as well. So I've included the link to the GCC library, but you should be able to find a link to the library on every single page of the GCC website. But the specific address is gcc.mass.edu/library/. But again, you should be able to access the library from any page on the GCC website. The thing with the databases, since you will be using them off campus, is that you need to have an access code, which means that you need to have a GCC library card. The good news is that it's quick and painless. You can do that in about 2 or 3 minutes online. The librarians are also available to assist, and they try to be as available as possible, particularly during these times. So you can access them through email, you can access them through social media, you can access them through telephone, you can access them through live chat. So I very much encourage you to reach out to them when you are doing research. That's what they're there for, basically. And certainly to spend some time looking at the databases, knowing that if you're using information from the databases, well, then you have a much higher level of protection. And I'll never forget what somebody told me in terms of, several years ago, in terms of the distinction between just being on, let's say, Google and using a database, and they likened it to having safe and unsafe sex. And they said that being on Google was like unsafe sex, and that you're taking your chances, you'll probably be okay, but you have to understand there's risk. And that being on a database was much like safe sex. Could something go wrong? Certainly, but it's less likely. So, and that's always stayed with me as I think a very good comparison between the two. In terms of documenting your sources, and if you've taken an English class, you know that this can be very detailed depending on the discipline. And for English classes and humanities classes and public speaking classes, the system of documentation used is known as the MLA, the Modern Language Association, where you're using parentheses after a quote to indicate something like a page number. And then at the very ending of your paper, you're listing all of your sources in alphabetical order. That said, there are lots of details about how you go about listing different sources, a book as opposed to a website, as opposed to a magazine article. So it's very precise. And it's something that usually most people don't memorize. You just look up and you follow what the rule is for that particular source. The good news, however, is that in public speaking, you aren't necessarily held to that level of detail. Because again, remember, the idea of public speaking is to communicate with your audience. Your audience is not going to want to be inundated with all of these specific details like publisher and place of publication. So basically what you're doing is you are giving a verbal tag. You're notifying your audience when something is not yours. And it could be as general as, according to experts. And that tag, so to speak, is basically my cue to you that whatever I say afterwards was not my original research, that this was based on experts. Now, that said, you as an audience member have the ability to question me about who those experts are and where I found that information. And I, being ethical, having ethos, and being well prepared, should have that information, whether it be in my notes or in my head, but someplace or another, and I should give accurate information if I'm questioned. Would I be questioned? Probably not, but that said, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should be sloppy and that you don't want to make things up, certainly, when you are giving a particular speech. So we'll talk more about this in speech 3, but basically what you need to do is to generally notify your audience when you're using another source. According to such and such would be perfectly fine. And then that's enough. And what I will ask you to do is on your speaking outline to please include the sources that you've used. I'm going to ask you to include 3 sources for your persuasive, your last speech, though you can use as many as you'd like, just so that I can take a quick peek at them. Again, I don't think this is necessarily going to be applicable to your second speech because you are not required to use outside resources. I encourage you to pick a topic that you have some familiarity with, perhaps a hobby or an interest. Perhaps it's something that you've learned about in another class. Perhaps it's something that you briefly addressed in your autobiographical speech that you could expand and develop. But that said, if you do need to use outside research, then I suspect that Chapter 6, supporting materials, will be useful to you. And there are lots of different ways to use outside resources. Interviews are one of many options that you've got when you are asking somebody who has some authority in the subject matter questions. And again, you want to be as ethical as possible and let that individual know while you're questioning them how you plan on using their information and getting their permission. If they don't give their permission, you don't use their information. Or if they want to remain anonymous, you present it in a way so that they are anonymous. And usually what happens is that you've got a mixture of qualitative evidence, which are anecdotes, as opposed to quantitative evidence, which are facts. And one is not better than another. They're both useful. Think about the idea of how we would go about trying to determine, let's say, factual or lived experience about a particular war. Certainly we would want to interview the soldiers involved. They would probably offer anecdotes. But we also want facts as well. And that gets us into the primary and secondary account. The primary account is the first-hand account. So that's somebody that's experienced something, the eyewitness account, if you will. And then the secondary account is based on the primary account. And again, if you think about scholarship is usually based on primary or first-hand accounts. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about outside resources as we continue to prepare for our speeches. But right now, your focus happens to be on your second speech. And what I'm going to do next class, which we have devoted to our quiz, is also I will be posting some sample student speeches for you to watch and to give some feedback on. But your attendance assignment is not to watch sample student speeches, but to actually watch your classmates' speeches that would have been uploaded to our Moodle site in the top section where you've got several folders such as the syllabus and our online chat and Zoom, and there's a folder there for the speeches as well. And what I'm going to ask you to do, and this is in the notes as well, not on the class form, but privately to me via email, if you could list a strength and weakness for each of those speeches. And then what I will do is I will compile that data and present that to that particular speaker. So, in terms of your first speech, if you haven't already submitted in your speaking outline to me, please do so. And you can send that via email, because what I will do is I will evaluate your speech and your speaking outline, and then I will contact you via email with your grade and with your feedback. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well. And I very much look forward to seeing what your feedback is. Take care. Bye-bye.